Welcome everyone to today's lesson. Hello and welcome to today's lesson, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Nice to see everyone. If you can see and hear me, pop into the chat. If there are any issues with sound or presentation throughout, just let me know. Just let me know by putting into the chat. It should be available for you to answer or ask any questions that you need to about the text we're going to be looking at today, which is again Othello. Again, this is a free stream from my Edspace and from me, Eleanor Does English, for Othello. This will cover what you need to know regardless of exam board for this topic. And we're going to deep dive today on Iago. These free streams will be taking place across the year as part of our new A-level English literature course, which is a 1-year course that will be part of these will be coming through as these free streams going forward throughout the year. We're going to be looking at Othello as we did in our previous lesson. Othello, focusing particularly on Iago. So focusing on the character of Iago and his trajectory across the play. Okay. So again, you're welcome to put any questions, comments, etc. into the chat. That makes A-level English literature what it is, which is a discussion-based class. So if you're learning this for the first time, or if you're using this as a refresh, possibly for year 13, before, for example, your mocks coming up, then feel free to ask the questions that you need to in order to do as well on that as you can do. So just to remind, if people haven't met me before through these streams, that I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the English teachers at my Edspace. I've taught A-level for 6 years now, and there's a little bit about my qualifications on the stream on the screen as well. But I'm hoping we can get straight into talking about the text. So some review first. So I'd love it if the people in the chat can pop straight into the chat their answers for these. Anything they know. It doesn't have to be written out in full sentences, doesn't have to be exam format, just what you know, so that I can see what you know, and then if there are any questions, I'm happy to address them as well, any confusions as well. It's just part of the learning process, so feel free and I will just correct any misconceptions. Okay. So I can see some people are typing in the chat already. Fantastic. Your questions are all focused on Iago for now, and we will look at lots of different ideas about Iago going forward. So first of all, who is he? Who is Iago? First of all, he is widely thought of as the antagonist, or the kind of opposite to the protagonist, the bad guy, the villain of Othello. He is the ensign for Othello, which is a position in the Venetian army. He's also sometimes called the standard bearer, or the flag bearer. These all come from Cinthio's version of the story, in which Iago doesn't have a name. He's just described as the ensign or the standard bearer. We know that he is part of the Venetian military. We know he's married to Emilia. We know that he's somewhat friends, I put that in quotation marks because it's questionable, with Othello, with Cassio, with Rodrigo. Okay. And what we also know about him, which is interesting, is that he's always known as so honest. His epithet or his nickname is Honest Iago. So there must be some kind of backstory here to why everyone trusts him so much. We know that he's incredibly clever as well, and that he's scheming to get revenge on Othello and Cassio, and that he uses Roderigo for his own means as well. Why does he claim to hate them all? Again, put answers in the chat to check to see if you're right. He claims to hate them all for a couple of different reasons here. First, just seems like general hatred. So just hates him without any reason. As Coleridge says, motiveless malignity, right? He also says because Iago himself was passed over for a promotion that he feels he deserves. That this would be to lieutenant. Which would be the person who takes over from Othello as general. So basically a second in command. Lieutenant literally means in lieu of the tenant. So in lieu of the person who holds that position now. So he's been passed over this for Cassio, who is Othello's best friend. Already tough to see that, right? That he's been promoted when he thinks Cassio doesn't deserve this promotion. He actually deserves it. And we can see that that's maybe arguable. He also says that potentially that Othello and Emilia are rumoured to have had an affair. We don't know who is spreading this rumour. We don't know anything about its validity. We don't know if he actually even believes this, or when this could have happened. But he says this at one point. We could also say it's because he's racist and prejudiced. And we can see that in the language he uses. And in kind of seeming like that might be the only reason he does hate Othello so much. And there are other reasons we could think, but these are kind of the main few that we can see here. One more to add to this, just before we move on. Possibly he's jealous. There could be some aspect of unrequited love here. Or unrequited, possibly masculinity, or something that Iago actually does love Othello, and Othello doesn't love him back in a romantic way. How does Iago get revenge on Othello? He gets revenge on Othello by suggesting that his new wife, Desdemona, is unfaithful with Cassio, his best friend. So in other words, two birds with one stone. He destroys Cassio because any threat to Othello's position or Othello's reputation would mean that he would attempt to destroy that threat. If masculinity, as we said, is completely determined by reputation, and that reputation is fundamentally built on the control that a man has over his household, then Cassio is a real and true threat, and any consideration of him being adulterous would be grounds to destroy him. So Iago knows that if Othello hears this, he'll destroy Cassio, and he'll also destroy Desdemona, both of whom are innocent. And because they're innocent, and this one is unjustifiable, Othello will also be destroyed. Because he has destroyed his wife, his best friend, and himself. And in this process of questioning this and dealing with this, he also loses his mind. He loses his friends. He loses everything. What's his motivation? This is a tough one, right? Hi, QC Blade. Nice to see you. Thank you for putting in the chat. Ready to learn some more Othello? Great. Scott, thank you for adding. Iago is motivated by jealousy and revenge, as well as some prejudice. I would say so. Prejudice. Absolutely. Possibly as well power, right? We could also say, and certainly the Jacobeans would have viewed him as motivated by pure evil, that he is a devil, kind of like a Lady Macbeth view of him. We could say by society, because Iago really does reflect quite a lot of the deepest, darkest prejudices of the society of the time. This is an inexhaustible list because there's so many different ways we can reframe these ideas, but this is a good start. Then, who are Iago's victims? Well, Othello is, but so is Desdemona, because she dies by proxy. So is Cassio, who isn't killed, but is certainly plotted against being killed because Iago sets Othello against Cassio and tries to have him killed. Rodrigo as well. Rodrigo, who Iago cons out of money by saying he'll help Rodrigo woo Desdemona, and literally and metaphorically stabs him in the back later as he's used as a pawn, P-A-W-N, to get what Iago wants. Can't leave out Emilia, Scott? Absolutely. Emilia, who again is kind of fodder for Iago, is used by Iago to get what he wants and is disposable. We can also think possibly Brabantio, right? Brabantio dies at the end out of grief for the marriage. And this is all stirred up by Iago. Iago's the one who tells Brabantio about this and gets him so stirred up about it, whereas the Duke seems that he would be much more accommodating to Othello otherwise marrying Desdemona. And then I've mentioned a little bit about this already. How might a Jacobean audience view Iago and why? Well, a couple of different ways we can think about this. We can think about them viewing him as a devil because he is motivated by this kind of sinful jealousy, possibly lust, by revenge. He's very malicious. He's spiteful. So not really in the fact that he hates Othello, but more because of the way he goes about it, by being such a manipulative, cruel Machiavellian character. Machiavellian, the Jacobean audience wouldn't necessarily know as a word, but it certainly does apply to Iago and how they would view in his mind. We could also say they view him as kind of reflective of society at the time, or of society's, as I said, society's prejudices. Because he is racist, he is prejudiced, he is suspicious of outsiders, xenophobic, right? And certainly his behavior in acting this way with Desdemona and his reaction to her marriage is really alarming in the way he goes about this behavior. So perhaps this reaction to a misogynistic relationship, interracial coupling, is reflective of society as well. And perhaps they would agree with him on that point. So, let's think about Iago first. Who is Iago? Well, first of all, what's in a name? Iago is a Spanish name. Based on what we know of the Jacobean era, why might Shakespeare have chosen this name for his villain? Perhaps because Iago, a Spanish name, the Spanish Empire is the biggest enemy, or one of the two biggest enemies, of Britain, of England at the time. There was a lot of anti-Spanish propaganda of the maliciousness of the Spanish, of the cruelty of the Spanish, of the power, the dark power of the Spanish as well. Was this based on anything in particular other than fear-mongering, xenophobia? Doesn't seem like it. But interesting that we have this character who the Jacobeans immediately would have thought of as a villain because he has this name. Because of this link with the Moors, so the Spanish king exiled all Moors from the country a little bit earlier than Shakespeare's time. Then this would have been a topical image, but would have married this idea of the Spanish and the Moors together. So it is conceivable that Iago and Othello-esque characters would cross paths in somewhere like a military career. And it's also conceivable that they would hate each other, right? Because the Spanish Empire was Catholic and the Moors were Muslim. So the Spanish, in exiling all the Muslims, exiled the Moors, exiled all Muslim practice from Spain. Now, how does this apply with Shakespeare's time as well? The Jacobeans would have also been extremely Islamophobic due to the fear of the Ottoman Empire, which was this other, capital O, in society who they viewed as kind of the opposite of them, and not just the opposite, but the negative, evil opposite of them. Powerful, well-dominating, large in their scope on the world, but dangerous because of their alternative views. And by alternative, I mean the different views to what the English at the time viewed as correct, which we certainly don't agree with. So this Jacobean fear of the Ottoman other, and also not just anti-Spanish propaganda, but this intensity of anti-Catholic sentiment as well. King James was doubling down on anti-Catholic practices and was preventing Catholics from practicing and enforcing really harsh punishments for practice of Catholicism. So if Iago is still an insider compared to Othello, he's not necessarily an insider to Venetian society if there are these kind of echoes in his name. This would have made him naturally villainous as well. So a tick list here we've got as well to think about the different ways we can view Iago. Ensign, experienced military professional. Passed over for a promotion to lieutenant by Michael Cassio. Married to Emilia, seemingly for a long time as they know each other very well. Exhibits racism, sexism, intolerance in speech and treatment of others, and perhaps jealous of Othello and Cassio's wives, lives, or position in society. It's hard to say what, because he changes his mind and seems to confuse us. Now, let's take a look at some arguments. I'm going to look at quite a few lines of argument with Iago as a character. So thinking about how we can look at him with the idea that you will go away with these ideas and think of them as different lines of argument that you can use to attack or tackle a question about Iago. So not just thinking of him in one way, just thinking of him as a villain, but thinking of him as different kinds of villains, or differently motivated, or in different sectors. Because with A level, you often get a broad or vague question like, how does Shakespeare present the character of Iago, or the relationship between Iago and Othello? And there's so much to say there that the pitfall is that you can become vague in your answer. What you actually want to do is develop really clear lines of arguments that quite track Iago's trajectory across the play, and consider the different ways we can look, for example, at his villainy, or perhaps if he's justified, or the different aspects to his character that we can concentrate on for a paragraph, and then move on and think about something else specific about his character. Okay? If there are any questions about this, feel free to put in the chat. So this is my first one, and over the course of the Othello lessons we're going to be thinking about how we can start to make these arguments on your own. If you're at the beginning of your Othello course, then you might be hearing these ideas for the first time and might be a little bit worried about constructing arguments on your own, or where you generate these arguments from. In looking at these characters first, I wanted to give you a really clear idea of the different ways you can look at characters, and then as we think about themes, crafting our own arguments. So presenting you a bunch of different ways of looking at a theme, and then thinking how we can formulate this ourselves into evidence gathered and evidence rich, device rich, really full analytical paragraphs. So, first idea here. Iago is a motiveless and evil villain. He says, I am not what I am. Now, if you recognise the phrasing of this at all, perhaps this is because this is actually a reversal of quite a few references in the Bible. One of which is, I am who you say I am, that Jesus says when he is asked if he is the Son of God. This is also a reference to another part of the Bible in which they say, I am who I am, or God's name also breaking down into the great I am. So why is it significant that Iago does a flip here to this language? First of all, he here is admitting that he's not to be trusted. He's also revealing, through this kind of parallel flipped language, or if you panic about what kind of device this is, you can just say the grammatical structure. Grammatical structure of the sentence does show that Iago is clever and confusing in his language. Language is clever and confusing. He's trying to obfuscate his meaning. So he's trying to kind of cloud his meaning so that it becomes really unclear what he's saying, right? Because he doesn't say what he is. And he kind of doesn't say what he's not. He just says, I am not what I am. So we can interpret this as whatever you think of me. So this idea of how he appears is not reality. Is not his reality. So in either words, don't trust me. But these echoes of this biblical allusion really position Iago as a kind of antithesis of good. Because if he's saying he's not what he is, and if God says I am what I am, well, that is God, then he is an anti-God. good or an anti-God. So that works us to he is a devil. If this seems like a bit of a stretch because of the kind of ubiquity of religion in Jacobean society, I would say it wouldn't be a stretch for the Jacobeans, and thus that we can interpret it as such. So he admits to us that he's not who he says he is. This immediately destabilizes the entire play. Because Iago is the person who speaks the most. One critic counted up, and it's something like 43% of the lines belong to Iago across the whole play. So he talks for almost half of the play altogether. What does this tell us? He is actually telling the story. He's the narrator here. Which is true, because he tells the other characters what they're thinking. And he tells us the story as well. As we said, these conventions of Greek tragedy mean that the tragedy starts in media res, which means in the middle of the action. What does this mean? This means that Desdemona and Othello are already married, and we're catching up to all of this having happened as the beginning of the play. Who is it who tells us this? Iago. So him being the constructor and the narrator of the dialogue actually happens all the way across the play, but he himself is telling us, do not trust me. So here we're left to then question reality, because we don't know what's actually true and what's not true. We're in the same position in a way as Othello, because as he says, she looks like she's honest. She seems honest with these Jacobean views of physiognomy, for example, and a moral character being evident through someone's outward appearance. If she's so beautiful, then she must be morally good. And Iago is the one who says, that's not true. You can't trust that. You can't believe what you see. He does this. In a way, he's an almost satanic figure who guides people into this temptation of questioning what they see and questioning reality in a really dangerous way, because then we're not sure what's true, right? We're not sure what's true. In what ways is he a villain? Okay, so he's a villain because he's devilish, first of all. Scott, it seems like Shakespeare always writes a clever villain in his plays, which is kind of cool. Yeah, he's not just giving us the easy way, is he? He makes us actually have to negotiate with our own feelings of villainy and whether it's as easy as that, right? A Jacobean audience, as soon as Othello is on stage, would think of him as the villain. That's not the case in our mind by the end of the play. And it's the same with Iago, right? He's on stage at the beginning, seeming good, then seeming bad, and then really seeming problematic, but we don't know where else to go. No one else is speaking. When he finishes speaking, the play finishes. How else can we think of him then? We can also think of him then as this kind of director, as Harold Bloom calls it. This director who shows us the play. And as we said in a previous lesson, makes us then complicit, because he tells us that he hates them more, and he tells us that he's going to get revenge on Othello, and we can't do anything about that. The audience is complicit in it because we're unable to warn Othello, of course, right? But we know what's actually going on. So we're stuck in this terrible dramatic irony of being unable to show the truth and being cued into the villain's side. How else can we think of this? We can think of this as Iago as a kind of corrosive influence on Othello. He's so manipulative here. And we can think not just about the fact that he's manipulative, because that also gets us here, right? This idea that he is in charge here and thus creates this narrative that he shows not just to us, but also to Othello, right? He tells Othello what is happening, and Roderigo, and Desdemona, and Emilia, etc. But then separately from this, what does his manipulation do to Othello? It makes Othello not Othello. It destroys Othello fundamentally by making him this well-respected general and loving husband to this animalistic, bestial, raging, frothing at the mouth, unable to see truth monster, in his own words. Can we also think of Othello in a different way? Of Iago in a different way? Can we think of him as jealous? He says he's jealous of Cassio. He says he's jealous of Othello. In Cinthio's original version, he is jealous of Othello because he's in love with Desdemona. Shakespeare changes this and makes it seem like he's maybe jealous of Desdemona in a way, that he wants to be with Othello. Maybe he's jealous of Cassio because of the closer relationship he has to Othello. Maybe he's jealous of Othello because he thinks that he's having an affair with Emilia. There's so much to here that this can be its own idea. We will be able to take a look at a little bit of queer theory, for example, to think about how that can go. We can also think with Iago of his relationship with his wife, with Emilia. As Scott said, can't leave out Emilia. Yeah, this is another dynamic that's done on purpose. As I said when I was talking through the differences between Cinthio and Shakespeare's version of this story, Emilia previously is basically nothing. She's Ensign's wife. She doesn't even have a name. But in Shakespeare's version, she's very talkative. She is, in some ways, the only one who can see Iago. And it's kind of on her that the whole plot disintegrates, because she is the one who reveals that it was Iago who asked her to steal the handkerchief and thus set it all up. And that whole extended part of Act 5, Scene 2, where she says, my husband told you this? My husband told you this? And Othello says, yeah, do you have ears? Yes, your husband told me this. He said that it was Cassio. That she is really the one that this hinges on. And Shakespeare gives her more credence, and I think it would be a disservice to ignore her entirely. Again, another thing to think here, is this justified? Could we ever think of Iago as justified? He is passed over for a promotion, and it seems like Cassio doesn't deserve it. Not least because he gives in to Iago's temptation, gets drunk and nearly kills someone, severely wounds someone on the first night. Not least because it seems like his it seems like in Iago's mind he deserves it because he has more experience than Cassio, who he says has never been in battle. But also this idea of the adultery. We forget, seemingly, that Iago and Othello are kind of in the same place in their minds, because both of them, supposedly under literally no evidence, have unfaithful wives. Why is Iago's version of this, of getting revenge on the person who supposedly committed adultery with his wife, seen as different than Othello's version of getting revenge on someone for having committing adultery with his wife. It's actually the same thing, right? So we read them differently, and I think there is something in that. We can also think of this justification as what this actually would do for someone in the Jacobean era, because remember, we are in the Jacobean era, and ideas like reputation and promotion and adultery were viewed differently, as we said previously in the lesson on gender and blackness, that adultery, cuckolding, was the worst thing that could happen to a man, the absolute worst thing. So even the suggestion of it was grounds for severe action. Here we go. We're thinking about this as maybe more justifiable in a Jacobean audience's minds than ours. And then we also want to think about Iago's ending. It's always important, I would say, in A-level to think about the trajectory. So first we start of him as this director of the play, as possibly jealous, then looking at this manipulation and the development of his relationship with different characters, and then taking a look at the ending. Because that's important, right? Shakespeare is choosing specifically where to leave us in this. And he leaves us with this ending. What's the ending for Iago? His villainy is revealed, and the word villain is said so much in that last scene. And an interesting word at that. We'll hopefully have time to get into that at some point. Then villainy revealed. He kills Emilia to stop her from revealing what happens. He refuses to speak. He refuses to justify his answers. He says, what you know, you know. Again, like that. I am not what I am. Such a convoluted way to say something that really does deny us the catharsis, in a way, of knowing what the reason was. Even Othello asks, can you ask the demidevil to tell why he ensnared my soul, though? Why did he do it? And he says, you know. And that's it. So we never get that catharsis. Refuses to speak and survives the play. Survives the play. The villain survives the play. And this is so interesting to us, right? There is so much scope for that. Why does Iago get to survive the play and Othello doesn't? They've both done the same thing. In fact, it seems like Iago's done worse. And it's all revealed and everyone knows it. Why does Shakespeare allow him to survive the play afterwards? Up for your interpretation. So let's think about this first line of argument then. Iago as a motiveless and evil villain. And I've put together for kind of the rest of this lesson different lines of argument with quotations that I think are beneficial to use. Are these the only quotations you can use for this? Absolutely not. Will they get you somewhere in arguing this point? Absolutely. Can you pair them with other parts? Definitely. That's kind of the point, right? Is thinking about this as a jumping off point for then you to talk about the places where you can prove that Iago is this motiveless and evil villain. So, I'm going to read this out and then pop into the chat anywhere that stands out to you as somewhere to prove that he's a motiveless and evil villain here. And then I'm going to highlight afterwards to give you a moment to put into the chat. And then we'll talk about it a little bit. Okay. So, Iago says, thus do I ever make my fool my purse. This is talking about Rodrigo. So, my fool is my bank. For mine own gain knowledge should profane that if I would time expend with such a snipe, but for my sport and profit. I hate them all, and it is thought abroad that twixt my sheets he has done my office. I know not if it be true, but I, for mere suspicion in that kind, will do as if for surety. He holds me well. The better shall my purpose work on him. Cassio's a proper man. Let me see now, to get his place, and to plume up my will in double knavery. How How? Let's see. After some time, to abuse Othello's ear that he is too familiar with his wife. He hath a person and a smooth disposed to be suspected, framed to make women false. The Moor is of a free and open nature that thinks men honest, that but seem to be so, and will as tenderly be led by the nose as asses are. I have it. It is engendered. Hell and night must bring this monstrous birth to the world's light. So take a moment to put into the chat, and we'll talk. So again, popping into the chat. Anything you would like to talk about, anything that stands out to you here? Some of these quotes you may be really familiar with, some of these you may not, depending on your knowledge. There's quite a lot here. We'll just talk through it a little bit. So, I won't write all the annotations that I'm talking. I'm just going to talk and occasionally point you out to some places. Feel free to take your own notes. As has been mentioned already, there is a workbook PDF free in the comments. Sorry, in the bio, so that you are able to do this as well. In the description of the video is what I mean. So you'll be able to make your own annotations. Okay, so Iago says, so ever I make my fool my purse. So immediately he is seeming malicious here because he speaks to Rodrigo as a friend, but then when he leaves, speaks differently about him. This idea of hypocrisy, it would be an alarm bell for a Jacobean audience, because again, it's this I am not what I am idea of being honest and truthful. This idea of masking or hiding one's truth, true character is very suspicious, because this is something that, for example, Satan does in hiding as a snake and forcing to tempt people into something. It also seems him as really scheming, right? Immediately. He's making money off this fool. And even the way he describes him with this idea of ownership here immediately, he does feel like he can just take what he wants and manipulate people. Again, like this idea of a director. And this should, for my own knowledge, should profane. This idea of profanity here when he's talking about spending time with such a snipe, so with such a sort of an idiot as Rodrigo. So he's saying, it would be terrible for myself to be spending time with this idiot if it weren't for my profit and sport. So I'm using him for fun. Again, this idea of using others and manipulation stands out here. And then seemingly, so randomly, this kind of jarring change to I hate them all. And what forceful language there, what short phrasing. And a lot has been made in criticism about this, and it is thought abroad that betwixt my sheets he's done my job between my sheets, so he's had sex with my wife, in other words. But this kind of seems tacked on to this I hate them all. And he says, I don't know if it's true, but for mere suspicion I will say it as surety. So he says, I will believe it to be true. Interesting that this very phrasing is very similar to that used by Othello's when he says to be in once doubt is to be at once resolved. So this idea of the effect of Iago on Othello, or perhaps this idea of actually contradicting this motivelessness, in that this adultery or cuckolding is a motive. But it seems like there's some kind of disconnect between I hate them all and it is thought betwixt my sheets. He holds me well. And then we shift again to this manipulation. He holds me well. The better shall my purpose work on him. So he's saying the fact that he regards me well and trusts me will actually make my plan easier. So it'll make it easier for me to manipulate him. Again, manipulation seems evil. And the fact that he knows it and is admitting it to us seems villainous to us. And then I will get them. And he's like, let me see now. So he's literally kind of like talking aloud, trying to plan this idea of double knavery. So kind of this double evil, double trickery he's doing here as he attempts to do this. How, let's see. And then to abuse. So we have all of this negative language to abuse Othello's ear that he's too familiar with his wife, right? So this idea, it seems in his own self-conception that Iago is doing something wrong. His language is peppered with this idea of villain, with this language of villainy, right? Of abuse and knavery and purpose, right? My purpose work on him. And interestingly, he hardly talks about Cassio. He says Cassio is a proper man, but then here he's talking about Cassio again, not using his name, which is interesting, right? It's already almost like he's immediately dehumanizing him, right? Thinking about him as just a fodder to be used. And he says he has a smooth disposition. So he has the kind of smooth, trustworthy face of someone suspicious. So again, revealing Iago's mistrust of appearances here as well. And the same in this juxtaposition between these two trusting characters, Iago and Cassio and Othello. Because he says that Cassio and the Moor, notice he doesn't say Othello basically ever. He says the Moor, so immediately foregrounding those prejudices there in those referential strategies. The Moor is of a free and open nature, so a trusting nature, that thinks men honest, but that seem to be so. This idea of seeming is so crucial in Iago's language, because it really does set up this idea of appearance versus reality as a theme here. And this really does link with suspicion here as well. And he says, we'll be tenderly led by the nose as asses are, so as donkeys are. So literally led. And this animalistic language again reveals his prejudices. So Othello as well is dehumanized as an animal through this use of zoomorphistic language. Zoomorphism being comparing people to animals, so kind of the opposite of personification. So again, thinking of the other characters as lower than him. And then very similar to the kind of hellish dark and light imagery in Macbeth, hell and night must bring this monstrous birth to the world light. So he's like, the darkness should bring this monstrosity to life. So he is seemingly hoping this to happen and thus aligning himself with both hell and night, despite the fact that he thinks of blackness as aligned with hell and night and devilry, right? So again, revealing his hypocrisy to a certain point, but also aligning himself with this, and then this is the perception, right? So the juxtaposition between what's evil and what people think of it. So, a couple of critics here then to have a think about how we could support this idea of Iago as this motiveless and evil villain who really just does seem like an evil, bad guy for seemingly no reason. So Coleridge, in a famous quote, says, "The character of Iago is fueled exclusively by motiveless malignity." So Coleridge spends time thinking about how Iago actually has no motive for his behaviour, just seemingly pure hatred, and that this isn't really justified. Even the reasons he gives are unjustifiable for what he does with this. And then Gardner as well says, "He's monstrous because faced with the manifold richness of experience, his only reaction is calculation and the desire to manipulate." So this really supports what we've got in that previous quotation as well, right? Because we can see him as this calculating, manipulative image and character and director. Ultimately, whatever its proximate motives, malice is motiveless. So if we're thinking of Iago as someone who has malice, has this kind of enjoyment of hatred and enjoyment of causing others pain, like spite, that is the secret of its power and its horror, why it can go unsuspected and its revelation always shocks. So this idea that no one ever suspects someone to not have a motive, right? We expect things to be justified. So the fact that Iago seemingly isn't, and the fact that we even try to justify this, seems dangerous, in that Iago even attempting to do things for the enjoyment, as he says, of watching the fools kind of make fools of themselves, or watching the world sort of collapse around him and society collapse around him, is villainous itself. So thinking of malice as villainous. Another kind of argument: Iago's a director. How can we prove that? Because that might be a new idea for quite a lot of people, unless they've studied Othello already. So again, another part of the same quotation, but we can use this to prove another point as well. So in a second paragraph, perhaps, we'd be referring back to some of these quotations, but thinking about them in a different way. "I follow him to serve my turn upon him." So here telling us why he's doing what he's doing. This idea of thinking men honest but seem to be so. Tenderly be led. I have it, it's engendered. He's like, I've got it, it's done. We've sorted it. So this idea of him telling us his scheme, sorting it all out, kind of almost walking us through it, does sound directorial. As well as this idea of he knows that he has to make things seem different than they are. He knows that Cassio and Desdemona are not having an affair, but he needs to make them look like they are. And he is bringing this to the world's light. So he's kind of crafting this image of darkness that he's going to bring into light, literally like put on stage for Othello, and watch these little scenes of the other characters seemingly being untrustworthy or seemingly being adulterous or unfaithful, but actually not being. So this depends on the construction of the play, in which Iago, standing to one side, sets up characters like Cassio and Desdemona to speak to each other about something in particular. He knows both of them, so he knows both of them how they're going to interact. And then he takes a further step back and brings Othello into the setting, tells Othello, what you're seeing over there is this. He knows it's something else, but he's telling Othello this. He knows that Othello trusts him, and he knows that Othello is too free and open and too trusting to not trust Iago. So he knows that this appearance will manipulate him enough. And then Iago takes a further step back and says to us, look at him. Look at what he's doing to himself. Look how dangerous it is to trust people. Look what a fool he is, acting this insane about something that's not happening, and look how powerful I am in doing so. Right? So as Scott said, the clever villain, which is cool. And the same with what Iago says. We said he talks a lot. He also points things out on stage, both to Othello and to us. He says, have you not sometimes seen a handkerchief spotted with strawberries in your wife's hand? So he is literally creating this idea here of pointing the ocular focus, and I use that word on purpose, ocular focus of Othello and thus us into something specific. So this is almost cinematic in a way, right? In that it's like we can zoom in on just the handkerchief in hand, right? Iago brings this up, then he places the handkerchief in specific places and points it out again when it's found there in order to guide not just Othello's view of what's happening and what he's looking at, but also our view of what's being looked at, right? So we are being guided here and literally forced to look at, our vision here is being guided towards something in particular. And that's dangerous as well, because if we don't take that step back for ourselves, we aren't necessarily aware of the fact that we're being manipulated as well, in our focus being guided into something so specific. And the imagery he points out as well, not that Iago is creating this imagery, but he is pointing out a symbol that for us carries a lot of weight, this handkerchief that's white, spotted with strawberries. So as we mentioned before about virginity tests and about this idea of white with red spots of blood, a handkerchief or a cloth with red spots of blood being an indicator of a consummated marriage with a virgin and the exchange of a consummated legal marriage. So this evidence then of the handkerchief with the strawberries being likened and becoming Desdemona's virginity, and ocular proof, as Othello says, so visual proof of her adultery, is something that Iago does, because Iago moves the handkerchief and then Iago points it out, and Iago's the one who gives it this weight, because he's saying, well, she has it, right? And it's special to you. And Cassio was wiping his beard with it and his mouth with it, and clearly he has it as a love token, right? And is moving it around towards people. Hi Shivan, thank you for joining us. Then as well, Othello says to Iago, if more thou dost perceive, let me know more. So he's literally saying, tell me more of what you see. If you see something, tell me. He doesn't say, if you do know more, let me know more. And so we can see that he is really putting all of his eggs into this basket of depending on Iago and Iago's version of events. Iago also tells Othello how to kill Desdemona when it comes to that. He says, do it not with poison, strangle her in her bed, even the bed she hath contaminated. He's telling him how to kill her. And it has poetic irony and poetic justice to it as well, as Othello himself points out. So it's ironic that he is killing her in her own bed, because that's supposed to be the bed where she committed adultery with Cassio. So it has this poetic justice of, I'm killing you with the thing that caused you to be killed and caused my rage. And he tells him, and he does it. So this idea of him just telling him, being the director of Othello's actions, sort of pushing him, prodding him into it. And Iago does this as well through these asides. He's always talking in asides. So he's always talking to us without other characters hearing. And he's narrating for us because no one else can hear it other than the audience. He takes her by the palm. Ah, well said, whisper. So he's looking at Desdemona and Cassio here, talking and watching them interact, and thus thinking, okay, this is going to be good for Othello to see, because Othello is going to take this wrong. It'll be easy to convince him that there's something here. When he says, he takes her by the palm. Ah, well said, whisper. With as little a web as this, I will ensnare as great a fly as Cassio. So this idea of Iago as a spider here, spinning these tails and this web. And there's a lot of web and trap imagery across the play. That means this is a motif here of the presentation of Iago as this kind of director or tricker or tracker. Nilda's crying over AQA. Hi, thank you for joining. Smile upon her, do. So yes, he's again narrating what he's doing. I will give thee thine in thine own courtship. So I will get you, like trick you in your own courtship here. You say true, 'tis so indeed. If such tricks as these strip you out of your lieutenantry, it had been better you'd not kissed your 3 fingers so oft, which you are now so apt to play the sir in. Well, very good, well kissed, and excellent courtesy. So indeed. Yet again your fingers to the lips, would they were cluster pipes for your sake. So this idea of he's like narrating what's happening with them, that Cassio is like playing with Desdemona's hand while they're talking, which is innocent, we know, but even we're starting to think, this looks bad. And we're the only ones aware of it. Everyone else is thinking this is innocent because it is. The dangers of suspicion. So, more criticism to think about this point. So Bloom, for example, says that it is Othello's tragedy, but Iago's play. So interesting here. That's such a nice quotation to incorporate into this argument, that it is Iago who is the focus of the action here and the person who is in charge. Iago is an artist of evil, so someone who constructs this, creates this evil. And no one in literature equals Iago in perfecting the arts of disinformation, disorientation, and derangement. So it's Iago who does all this and has this effect on others. And Levis also says the tragedy is inherent in the Othello and Desdemona relation, and Iago is a mechanism necessary for precipitating tragedy in a dramatic action. So he is necessary for this tragedy to take place. Another really good way to bolster your argument that this is a positive proof of Iago's necessity in this action. And Neil also says, one of the terrifying things about Othello is its racial poison seems so casually concocted, as if racism were just something that Iago, drawing in his improvisational on a gallimaufry of quite unsystematic prejudices and superstitions, made up as he went along. The characteristic pleasure he takes in his own felicitous invention only makes the effect more shocking. Iago lets horrible things loose and delights in watching them run. This idea of watching and letting them loose. The play also seems to share that narcissistic fascination, or better, Iago is the voice of its own fascinated self-regard, so its own fascinated watching of itself. The play thinks abomination into being and then taunts the audience with the knowledge that it can never be unthought. What you know, you know. It's this idea that Iago gives us these negative ideas, then says, haha, now you think them too and you can't not think them. It's a technique that works close to the unstable ground of consciousness itself. Okay, so this idea of playing with consciousness and playing with what we know and what is subconscious for us. It'd be almost as difficult to say whether its racial anxieties are ones that the play discovers or implants in an audience as to say whether jealousy is something that Iago discovers or implants in Othello. So this idea that the racial anxieties here, are they implanted in us? And is jealousy something that Iago can implant in Othello? Or is it something that's already in us? Again, thinking about Iago's role here. Now let's think about Iago and Othello and the influence on. So this is probably your most standard paragraph here, but it's not everything, right? You wouldn't want to do 5 paragraphs on this because that wouldn't show your construction of arguments so well. That would be fine for GCSE because you don't have the time or necessarily the lines of argument to create such different ideas in that format. But here we can think for a paragraph about Iago being a corrosive influence. What does that mean? That means that he is something that is actively marring and corrupting and poisoning Othello. And let's take a look at these quotations from all across the play here and what stands out to them. Poison his delight, plague him with flies. The moor already changes with my poison. Othello says, oh, it comes o'er my memory, as doth the raven over the infectious house. So a raven being a harbinger of death. And this idea of his brain being an infectious house, so literally being contaminated with the poison that Iago is giving him. Iago says, my medicine works. By medicine, he doesn't mean something to cure Othello. Or maybe it is, right? He's thinking curing him by killing him, right? Curing society of having the problem that is Othello. Thus, credulous fools are caught. And then notice as well this idea of being caught, being tricked, being trapped. And then notice how this affects Othello here. Confess, handkerchief, O devil, falls into a trance. So literally falls into what we would say is an epileptic fit. So these stage directions here being crucial. And this episode of Othello's fit being literally, it's physically affecting him, not just mentally, not just spiritually, not just in his mind, but physically he is so corrupted by Iago's influence that he literally falls into an epileptic fit. That's not to say that that's how fits work in modern life. That's to say how Jacobeans would have viewed this trance that Othello is in. And this is when Iago says, again, work on my medicine, work. So again, this idea of medicine kind of pouring into Othello, and as a poison would do, not just entering and killing, but entering and corroding and corrupting all of these parts of Othello and damaging them fundamentally, literally affecting his mind and body. He is so much so that he cannot speak. Do you remember the Othello of Act 1, Scene 3, where he is talking about his love story and saying in such beautiful phrasing about Desdemona and speaking in this beautiful iambic pentameter? Now he is incoherent. So linguistically even, Othello's been corrupted by Iago. And Iago also says, and practicing upon his peace and quiet even to madness. So this is what's happening to him. He's changing from peace and quiet into madness. And again, we see this in Iago, in Othello's own language, across the play, building across the play. He says, the fountain of my love has become a cistern or a sewer for foul toads to not engender in. So he's saying my mind and my love, my heart, has become a cistern, a sewer for toads who are familiars of witches and the devil. So these devilish evil creatures to kind of climb all over each other like this and to gender, so to reproduce in. So not only this idea of his mind being this filthy place, but also his mind being filthy, that filthiness is growing and building and populating more and more. So it's like this idea of this sickness or this disease spreading. And Othello says this again at the end, because this is what he views should be his punishment. Once he realizes that Desdemona, of course, is innocent, he realizes that this should be his punishment. So he's saying that these punishments from hell should already start on him. They should be his punishments, because he is already in hell, having destroyed what he loves and having done something so unforgivable. So we can see that he is now asking for poison and fire and suffocation of these kind of vile winds, this idea of contaminated air, being something he is now asking for to permanently kill him, because he's already been so infected with it. And Ludovico, a tertiary character, I would say, by that I mean like a kind of third level character here, tells to Iago, points to the bed where Desdemona, Emilia, and Othello are lying dead and bleeding everywhere. And he says, "This is thy work. This is thy work. The object poisons sight. Let it be hid." Scott, take care. You'll be able to access this later, because the live stream will still be visible for you if you need to watch back the last 20 minutes. Thank you for joining and for contributing. Okay, so this is thy work. So he's pointing to it saying, look at your work. It poisons sight. So looking at this poisons us. The object here poisons sight. So it poisons who it looks at. It affects us like a poison. It says, let it be hid, so we can't look at this anymore. So the consequence of Iago's work, of Iago's doing, is poisonous, even for characters who he wasn't acting on. So this idea of secondary passing on, this idea of this violence being so poisonous and evil and terrible that it could corrupt the people who even view that. And let's see what the critics say about this idea of him being corrosive. So Levis, who's one of the most popularly cited critics of Othello, published a long time ago, so there is definitely kind of the racist views of Levis's time are still part and parcel of his analysis. But he does say some interesting things about Iago. And he says, although Iago's notorious artistry is usually linked to his capacity to shape a plot. Okay, so first of all, this idea of his artistry, this idea to shape a plot, it extends as well to characterization. So he doesn't only create the plot, he also creates the characters. What do we mean? For the Othello he, in many ways creates, comes to see himself as his own stereotype. So what is Levis saying? He's saying that Iago creates the Othello who destroys Desdemona, who becomes this tragedy. He creates this evil Othello who becomes monstrous. Not only does he do that, he also gets the Othello to believe that he is this character. So there's this idea of Iago creating and relying on the stereotypes of society to formulate this version of Othello that Iago tells Othello is him and manipulates him into being. And Othello is so caught by this that he believes that he is who Iago tells him he is. So, corrosive, could this work for Iago being a director as well? Absolutely. Could this work for anywhere you want to prove that Iago's influence over Othello is harmful? Yes, absolutely. Could this work in an essay on prejudice? Certainly as well. Anywhere where we can think of Iago's role here is really powerful. Neil also says, Iago drives Othello to question his own manhood, indeed his very humanity, by making him doubt whether he has power over his wife. So this idea of Iago driving Othello to question himself, even his humanity, by making him doubt So this doubt corrodes Othello. Iago knows this. He reinforces this. He drives Othello to his own destruction, his own loss of humanity. And then Honigman says, Iago's a liar, a betrayer, and a mental torturer. So this idea of Iago as someone who's untrustworthy, who betrays who he loves, or seemingly doesn't love, betrays the people around him who he owes love, but also this mental torturer, right? He destroys Othello, as we can see in that previous slide, where we see how far Othello has fallen from this beautifully phrased loving husband to this catatonic, spitting, murderous figure. Let's think about it a different way again. So apologies if I'm moving fast. I just want us to think about quite a lot of our ideas here. So Iago says, I humbly do beseech you of your pardon for too much loving you. They also say, Othello, I'm bound to thee forever. Iago says, I am your own forever. Could we argue that this love or this relationship is more powerful or more influential or more important than Othello's with Desdemona? Absolutely. Because, first of all, because of Jacobean views of masculine relationships as more important because they were a meeting of minds. Man-woman marital relations were viewed as a kind of transaction of reproduction, right? They were not viewed as equals, so they didn't have kind of the friendship of being equals. Emilia is transgressive for even talking back to Iago and seeing him kind of as who he is. But male-male masculine relationships in the Jacobean era were a meeting of minds as well as hearts. They didn't think that men and women loved or thought the same, so it was only a man who could understand another man. Do we know that Iago is lying when he says, I beg your pardon for loving you too much, and that they're bound to each other forever and you're your own forever? Interestingly, in this part here is when Iago and Othello are kneeling and holding hands, making this promise that they will go through this time together and making this pledge to each other to get revenge together on Desdemona and Cassio, that ironically seems like a kind of marriage to each other, right? Kneeling together, holding hands, promising to each other. It seems like perhaps there is something here in which Iago is jealous of Othello, or Iago's jealousy comes from loving Othello, and that he thinks that this marriage needs to be destroyed for his own love. And this brings us to this idea of queer theory, which is a kind of lens of critical theory in which you're addressing these potentialities for different sexualities, how they're presented, if they're included, if we can interpret previously presented relationships as queer in some way, and paying attention to these historical and socio-political systems of oppression, these institutional inequalities in patriarchal and heteronormative societies that meant that this would not be a society in which a man can just marry a man if they both love each other. It's not to say that people weren't gay at this time, they absolutely were, but they were unable to act in the same way in these behaviors. So it's not that men weren't in love with each other, it's just they weren't necessarily to be open about it in the same way that we would recognize. So queer theory is a way of analyzing Iago or Othello, or perhaps Cassio as well, as perhaps having some kind of sexual anxiety towards each other, some kind of fear of this woman replacing them, some kind of jealousy over perhaps Iago jealous of Cassio and Othello's relationship. There is this anxiety of being replaced or being not loved the most. Now, Again, a different way of thinking. Is Iago's revenge justified? So this is when he's talking again about the promotion. And he says that Cassio is someone who's almost damned in a fair wife. Says such a most beautiful fair wife that he's, must be evil for having such a good wife. He never set a squadron in the field, doesn't know battle more than a spinster knows sex, is what he's saying there. So he doesn't know battle as much as a virgin doesn't know about anything about sex. He's saying that he's bookish, so he knows about the books. So he's a mathematician as well. He says anyone can talk about the maths part of battle, but he's just all chat without practice, is all his soldiership. But he had the election, whereas Iago had done all of these things. He'd been at Rhodes, at Cyprus. He'd seen the proof on grounds both Christian and heathen. He'd been becalmed. But, of course, Cassio still wins it. And Rodrigo says, I would rather have been his hangman than this. And it is originally interpreted that Rodrigo is just being racist, right? He's saying, I'd rather be his hangman than be friends with him. His executor, in other words. But maybe he's saying, I would rather kill him than put up with such an injustice. And Iago says there's no remedy, it's the curse of service. Preferment goes by letter and affection, not by gradation. So not by who deserves it, but by who loves who. Popularity contest, in other ways. Judge yourself in any just terms. So now he's saying, do I have any just reason to love them more if he's done this to me? And Rodrigo says, no, essentially. I wouldn't follow him. And he says, I am only following him to get my revenge on him. And Bradley says that Othello treated Iago abominably in preferring Cassio to him. This is a gross violation of military rules and practices. And Iago, who's supposed to trust Othello as his general, can't trust him. His confidence is ceased. So it's like their friendship is over in betraying Iago's trust this way. This is a completely different way to think about it, right? But one that definitely bears fruit to analyze. Now, we've looked at this a little bit already. This is thinking of Emilia as unfaithful. Emilia is thinking, I do nothing but to please his fantasy. So this idea of maybe Emilia knows about Iago's kind of construction of reality. Perhaps he's just trying to do everything to please him, please whatever his wildest wishes are. Emilia at the end says, disprove Othello if you're a man. Whoa, right? What fighting talk to say to a man in the Jacobean era. He says that thou, informal way of talking that shows a power dynamic that's much more even than you. His wife was false. I did that. Thou art not such a villain. So she's trying to defend him, saying, I know you're not a villain. Tell me you didn't say this villainous thing that caused Desdemona to be slandered and then killed. I told him what I thought and told him no more than what he found himself was apt and true. If you tell him it's false, I did. You told a lie, an odious, damned lie, a wicked lie. Did you say with Cassio? So it's Emilia who actually reveals all of this. Iago says, zounds, hold your peace, which is a swear, God's wounds. Hold your peace, the imperative. So immediately he pulls rank in terms of husband on Emilia, as soon as she starts to threaten him. Twill out. I will speak as river as the north. So she's the one who's important here because she is the one revealing him. And Iago says, be wise, get you home. And draws his sword on Emilia. So draws his sword on a woman. Graziano says, fire your sword upon a woman. He can't believe this. The fact that Emilia is going to be killed in order to keep Iago's business quiet and schemes quiet. De Luca says he swears vengeance even though he has no proof, but his reason is suspect. He doesn't love his wife. He sacrifices her just to preserve his own game here. He wants people to believe he is every man, someone who's out and kind, honest and kind. But he tells people not to trust what he says. This reason of being angry of the infidelity is one of convenience. So it's like he hates them all and then later comes up with a reason for why he should. Heilman also says he hates yet lusts are what he can't have and does anything to destroy it. Right? He doesn't have this love or doesn't have Desdemona, so he tries to destroy it for everyone else. What happens to him? He bleeds but is not killed. And Othello asks him, once he finds out, he says he believes Cassio. He says, will you pray, demand why this demi-devil, why he hath thus ensnared my soul and body. So he's not even talking to Iago. He's saying, Cassio, can you ask him why? And Iago says, demand me nothing. What you know, you know. From this time forth, I never will speak a word. And he never says another word. So this manipulation has been the prime target for him to theorize about his motive. We don't know what it is. He doesn't say. And his lack of contrition is the thing that's really alarming, right? He doesn't feel bad at all. He does not care. The same here. The devilish charisma, seductive intimacy, he makes us complicit to implicate us in his hatred and entrapment of Othello, whether we like it or not. So we here are left with this lack of catharsis as we're stuck. Briefly, because we are running out of time, in what ways is Iago a foil for Othello? I won't write, I'll just speak so that we can cover these last couple of ideas. In what ways is he a foil? He's a foil because Othello is honest and truthful and Iago is deceptive. Because Othello is an outsider and Iago is, to a certain point, an insider. They're both seemingly cuckolded men. They're both military men. They're both in the same places at the same time. They both fear the same things. But Iago is everything dishonest, manipulative, cynical, untrustworthy. And Othello is everything that is overly trusting and naive. So in this way, even the black and white of their characterization makes it really clear how much influence Iago has, but also how opposite they are. And in Iago's influence, he makes Othello more like himself. And Othello's capitulation to this downfall makes Iago reveal what he is. So they both are revealed to be what they are. Who are Iago's victims? We've covered this already, but thinking about it, Emilia, Othello, Desdemona, we've got Cassio, Rodrigo, Brabantio, truth, honesty, Venetian society. We've got stability here. They're all pawns for Iago's victimhood. Then finally thinking, what does he gain? What does he lose? He gains power. He gains control. He gains revenge. He gains money from Rodrigo. He gains satisfaction here. He gains schadenfreude. He gains, really, for the most part, control over so many people across this. And he gains chaos, really, as well. He loses his wife, his best friend, his position, his seemingly life, his freedom, certainly, his friends, and his good name. That idea of him being honest Iago is lost for us. So when we think about these lines of Othello lines of argument for Iago, we can think of him in so many ways. So just to consolidate for us in our final minute, we can think of him as, firstly, evil, right? And motiveless. We can think of him as a director here of these scenes. and a manipulator of Othello and the other characters. Then we can think of the influence his manipulation has on Othello in particular, but we can also spin this out to thinking about the consequences, like everyone is dead. This idea of the corrosiveness and the poisoning of Othello's character. We can think of him as being jealous of Othello for lots of different reasons. We can possibly think of him as justified. We can think of his ending first of all, let's think of him with Emilia. His relationship with Emilia as revealing his true character. So it's like she is his undoing. And interesting to think about gender roles and how that plays there. And then we can think about his ending. Is there catharsis? Does he get what he deserves? What is his motive? Why are we so unsatisfied? Why is he allowed to live? And this is more paragraphs than you'll be able to do in an A-level essay that's timed, but certainly it would be a great idea for you to try and tackle some of these lines of argument for your own, because these are ones that you can use with anything to do with Iago. We can think of them in essays to do with Iago and Othello, or about love, about jealousy, about appearance versus reality, about the plot as a tragedy, about control, about power, about evil. All of these questions have come up in exam questions before, so they are fair game to come up again, or ones like them, for example, for your mocks as well. But they're also certainly ways of revising for this character, because there's so much to say about it. As Bloom says, this is really Iago's play. And with that, thank you so much for coming to this free stream, this lesson, and all of the A-level English literature lessons will be free content for everyone on YouTube. My profile is below, so you'll be able to see more about me and the content I've made so far on Othello. This will be free for you to watch back at any time, so if you need to revise before your mocks, then feel free to watch this again. Thank you so much for contributing and for watching. I hope you give me a follow so that you'll be able to hear about more content like this going forward. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.